When you hear the word Albert, you think of the person. You think of this loving, very complex, but also a sweetness, this charismatic. When I say the word Einstein, it's a different word because it's now been institutionalized. Am I wrong? If I say the word Albert, you think of a person, but if I say the word Einstein, what about Einstein? What do you think of?
I think of genius, mostly. I think that Einstein has become the kind of figurehead or the poster boy of genius.
You separated the man from the myth. Albert is the man, but Einstein in some ways was the myth. Joining us now on Open Book, Samuel Graydon. He's an author and science editor of the Times Literary Supplement. But boy, you wrote a phenomenal book, Sam, and I want to congratulate you on that. It's called Einstein in Time and Space, A Life in 99 Particles. And so, first off, congratulations on the book. I am sharing with all my friends and some of my adult children. When people think of Albert Einstein, they think of a genius. But your book, I think even Walter Isaacson's book in some ways gave him a little bit of a human side. But why did you decide to hone in on this angle?
Well, so as you mentioned, and thank you, by the way, thank you for saying the book is nice. I am the science editor of the TLS, the Times Literary Supplement, and so I get sent a lot of science books, and I read them or I get them reviewed and read the reviews. And I noticed as I read most of the science books that were being published over so many years that if the book was about physics, any aspect of physics, Einstein was invariably mentioned. He was always mentioned with respect. He seemed to be some kind of progenitor, an archetype, and somehow always foundational in any aspect of modern physics. And I thought, well, I just have to get to know. He seems too important to ignore. I should get to know him.
Hey everyone, it's Anthony Scaramucci here with some straight talk. Let me tell you, we've got 85% of our viewers who haven't hit the subscribe button yet. What's up with that? It hurts. Listen, I made my career by going all in. Right now, only 15% of our viewers are part of our subscribed family. So please take action. This helps us book more amazing guests. Hit subscribe, join our community, and let's turn these numbers upside down. Now back to the show.
And the more I read about him, the more fascinated by his life I became. The science is truly amazing. But the more I read about him, the more his life stood out to me as a story worth telling in its own right.
Okay, so the book goes through 99 snapshots, or let's, as you call them, particles of Einstein's life. How did you go about selecting those? And remind us why the number 99, which I think is fascinating. Tell us why 99 is so significant.
Yes, that is one of the particles in itself, and that is to do with the element Einsteinium, which is right at the end of the periodic table. Well, not quite anymore, but it was right at the end of the periodic table when it was discovered. And it was discovered in the aftermath of the hydrogen bomb explosion in the Bikini Atoll. Drones were flown through the air with filter paper, and they picked up some of the coral that had been obliterated by the blast and sort of investigated that. And they discovered a new element had been created by the force of the blast. And they decided to name it after Einstein for various reasons. Einstein had just died, and it was a way, in effect, of honoring him for that. But there was a sort of intention, the idea that he was the founder of the atomic bomb was still sort of in the air at the time. And the idea that E equals mc squared is pivotal to it played into this. And I just latched onto the idea that Einstein as a man was so multifarious. As I was saying, his life is fascinating, and he comes across as far more complicated human than I expected. And I latched onto the idea that just as with an atom, an element, it is composed of all of these different parts. And I thought that so was Einstein composed of particles, in quotation marks. He's composed of all these different parts that make up a whole. So that was the metaphor, anyway.
I love that, and you also go into his upbringing, his parents, his sister. I believe I'm pronouncing her name right. Maja, I believe is her name. Maleva Marek, who was his first wife. Tell us a little bit about those relationships, and who do you think was most influential on him?
Um, that's a good question. I think Maya is how I've been saying it anyway, his sister,
Maya.
and
Okay, I'm
she,
sorry.
well, that's no,
Yeah.
that's I may well be wrong, but she. I mentioned her early on because she's one of the sort of constant relationships that he has that's sort of quite good. Einstein has reasonably volatile relationships with those close to him, and apart from his sister, except that I tell a very early anecdote of him, I think, hitting her over the head with a bowling ball. I think it is. He was quite violent as a child when he didn't get his way, which actually is pretty indicative of how he is as an adult. In a slightly, he wasn't hitting people over the head with bowling balls when he was an adult, but he liked to get his own way. But I think out of the ones you mentioned, particularly his first wife, Mileva Maric, is a hugely influential figure on him, and their relationship is a kind of slightly tragic story. Really, they were very desperately in love at university. His parents oppose the marriage, and he sort of fights for it. And then through one particular tragedy, but is tipped over into a sort of bitterness that eats away at their marriage until really it's a very acrimonious divorce at the end. And the one incident that I think kind of tips it over, I mean, Einstein, I think they would have divorced anyway. He just hated constraint of any kind. Marriages were not really for him. But they have an illegitimate daughter, so they give marriage gives birth to a daughter outside of marriage with Einstein. But that was enough at the time for society to effectively not have given Einstein a job. So he was on a job search for several years, and he got this job lined up, and then marriage gave birth to a daughter, and so they just kept her secret. They simply didn't tell anybody about her existence, not Einstein's parents, not his friends. Eventually, when he did have two sons with marriage, they never found out about her. They almost erased her existence completely. It wasn't until about the 1980s that she was first known about. And and so we don't quite know what her fate is, but she was definitely given away. And it seems likely that she would have died at some point, at the age of 2, possibly. Einstein literally never saw her. Never once went to see his daughter. Um, and the death or certainly the sort of permanent separation from the daughter, I think, kind of twisted that relationship in such a way as to kind of lead it on a road to a very nasty divorce.
I was dying to ask you this question when I was reading your book. Do you think genius or this type of thought pattern that led to all of these great discoveries by Albert Einstein, it comes with some exigences of abnormal social behavior, or is that a one-off? I'm overly reading into it, or do you think that it's just part and parcel for being this sort of nonconformist, out of the box sort of thinker?
It's a very interesting question, particularly in relation to Einstein. So thank you. Um, and that's because I think I went into the book thinking that Einstein would be this sort of unrelatable character that I couldn't, because he was a genius. He was sort of on another plane of existence almost that was somehow removed from my kind of understanding of everyday existence. Um, but what I found was that he was really quite normal, much more normal than I thought, Einstein. He was a genius. I think that having spent about 3 years with him, I find it categorically true that he was a genius. His work is just so groundbreaking. But it's achieved against the backdrop of very solid work. he's not this sort of transcendental genius who sits back in a chair and then a lightning bolt gives him an idea. He works very hard, and indeed, in moments of personal distress, he sort of works even harder. He buries his head in the sand. I think he says that. He says, "I bury my head in the sand like an ostrich" after his first breakup. Even when he's 16, he says that that's what he does in a very accurate self-analysis that remains true all of his life. But also, he isn't sort of monomaniacal either. He's not just this sort of crazed physicist who only cares about atoms. He's very much of the world and very outspoken about his politics and very outspoken about sort of the general intellectual trends. He loved music. He had a lot to say about music. He thought Mozart was top, and he really, really cared about that. And so he was a sort of active and he had loads of friends. He wasn't a recluse. He was admired and loved by basically everyone he met, excluding his family. He was. I think that he sort of sets.
There was some anti-establishment nonconformity to his personality, right? I can identify that with that, by the way, because I'm a little bit like that.
Yes,
I'm
certainly.
Not a genius, I'm just a nonconformist.
Well, it's not for me to say, actually. But yes, you're right in the sense that. So there's a nice anecdote I tell in the book about C.P. Snow, who was a physicist and author. He goes to visit Einstein on Long Island, where Einstein is summering, and Snow sort of writes up this very nice essay about his meeting with Einstein. And there's a point at which Einstein and him are discussing Britain. Snow is English. And he says, "Oh, why don't you move to Britain?" And Einstein says, "Oh, well, I've been to Britain." And I think he got shown around, all these stately homes, and then he got shown around Oxford. And he said, "I was just, there were butlers everywhere, and I was changing in and out of evening dress all the time." And he just sort of imagined Britain as this place where you were constantly shifted between clothes and butlers. And Snow says, "Oh, no, it's not like that." And Einstein says, "No, I want no Zwang." This is a German word, Zwang, and Zwang means constraint in like the broadest possible sense. In societal kind of intellectual. That's why marriages are not very good for him, particularly sort of any kind of constraint on him. He wanted to rail against, and I think that the kind of anti-establishment stuff that he comes out with. So, as I said, he's very outspoken about politics. He hated McCarthyism, for example, and was, very vocal about that, and told by various people to go back to Russia and things as a result. But I think that comes from this personal sense of a complete sort of instinctive want of freedom, individual, intellectual, emotional freedom. And I think that that's where that kind of originates and then goes out from there.
Now, he also, sort of interesting, I didn't know this until I read your book, he was offered the presidency of Israel.
Yes.
And so, very senior role in Israel. There's a prime minister and a president. He would have been the second president of the state of Israel. So I'm going to wrap two questions into that. One is, tell us about his relationship with Judaism in general, because you write about it beautifully in terms of ages 9 to 12, how he was developing his faith, and then how he had a little bit of a revelation related to the faith. But there he is in the 40s being offered this. He says no, of course, but take us through the story. Take us through his relationship there, and how does a Nobel Prize winning scientist get offered such a high profile political job?
Yes, it's a very good question. I was surprised when I learned about it. So his relationship with Judaism, as you say, starts really when he's about 9. His family were not religious in traditional sense; they didn't practice Jewish rituals. But when he's 9, sort of develops this complete fervor for religion. He writes his own hymns. He sings them on the way back from school. He obeys kosher dietary laws, and his family doesn't. And so he completely immerses himself in Judaism. And then as quickly as that comes, it goes at the age of 12, just before he is due faithfully to have a bar mitzvah ceremony. But I think, again, is somewhat related to this idea of constraint. I think the idea of sort of formally committing to Judaism did play a part in his then casting it off. But also he put it down to the sort of scientific awakening. So the idea that he then struggles with the idea of God, and he comes to the opinion that God doesn't exist. Or he comes to a very idiosyncratic idea of God, which is based on Spinoza, and it's the idea that the universe is God, effectively. But it's not orthodox, in it, to say the least. And that really is his sort of religious phase of his life entirely. He never comes back to religion. However, when he moves to Germany, but to Berlin, kind of in 1914, he starts to become kind of more pleased with the idea, more accepting of the idea of belonging to a community of the Jewish people. And he sees it, I think, as well as a community of tribal companions as opposed to religious fellows. The idea that sort of outside of religion, he is a Jew. And that's partly in response to growing anti-Semitism in Germany at the time. And that's partly as a result of meeting Jews in Germany who have assimilated into the culture. So I think he describes it as combating anti-Semitism by getting rid of everything Jewish, is what he says. So the idea that you kind of adopt local, national customs rather than Jewish ones. And he dislikes this idea entirely, and so kind of awakens him to the idea of being Jewish. And he sort of funnels his sort of Jewish awakening into Zionism, the idea of creating a Jewish homeland. So he's against the idea of creating a Jewish state, but is for a Jewish homeland. And he then campaigns very vigorously for that for the remainder of his life. It's not about 1922 is his first visit to America, and that's to raise money for the Zionist cause. He's a complete celebrity. He's, hoisted onto the arms of people. They have motorcade after motorcade. And he goes around America to raise money. It's very successful, and he sort of throws his weight behind the cause for the rest of his life. And that is slightly answering your question of why do they offer him this? It's because he's been a very prominent Zionist. But also, I think in the newspapers at the time they say, the newspapers say, of course this must go to Einstein. He is the most famous Jew in the world. That's faithfully, I think, a direct quote. And David Ben-Gurion, the Prime Minister, basically says, well, yes, of course, he is the most famous Jew in the world. We have to have him as president. And then immediately regrets the decision.
So there's obviously a persecution angle, right? He feels the need to flee the Nazis in Europe. He comes to the United States. He writes this incredibly famous letter to Franklin Roosevelt, this describing what he thinks is the capabilities, the physical properties to create a nuclear weapon.
Yes.
We learn in the movie Oppenheimer that he's urging Roosevelt to build the bomb, but then he went through a journey of pacifism. Talk us through some of Einstein's regrets about his contributions to the Manhattan Project, which was the project that led to the development of the bomb.
Indeed, yes. It's interesting. Actually, Einstein had no role actually in the Manhattan Project. So he sends this very famous letter to Roosevelt saying, I think, sir, you should set up a nuclear program. And that is kind of what gets the wheels turning. Then when the Manhattan Project is set up a few years later, because of the absolutely enormous FBI files that is on Einstein, the FBI are kind of trying to get Einstein. They just suspect that he's a communist and kind of sort of hate him, really, on a personal level. He's denied security clearance to work on the project, so he has no role, despite being one of the most famous scientists in the world and having quite extensive direct knowledge of the physics that's going on. at the Manhattan Project, he is refused because they suspect that, or the FBI suspect that he would be a communist spy. Um, and that's just, I mean, the FBI file is fascinating. It's a truly mad document. But it doesn't really relate to his regrets about the nuclear bomb, which were severe. He, even within his lifetime, was seen as the father of the nuclear bomb and has to at some point outright state, he says to a newspaper,
Mm-hmm.
"I am not the father of the bomb," because it's drawing on some of his science, but he didn't play such a direct contribution. And nevertheless, he did feel a sort of deep personal responsibility for the utter destruction that he saw from the bombs.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a committed pacifist, really. So it was a very sort of tense battle in him for the remainder of his life.
It's just this amazing paradox. You have these brilliant people that are generally pacifists, and they create the greatest war weaponry in the history of mankind. Let's go to
Yes.
something a little bit more fun, which I loved about your book. Einstein's a ladies' man. Tell us about that, Sam. It's a bit of a flirt, no?
Yes, to put it mildly, I think a flirt and more. Yes, was he had almost a countless amount of affairs. I think if I had tried to put every affair he had into the book, it would be several hundred pages longer. Um, he, as I said, Zhuang, he did not want constraint. He tells his second wife outright that he is going to have affairs, that he doesn't believe that people are monogamous, and that he's not going to be faithful. And they have, and she goes through the marriage, but they have quite severe rows about it. There's one of his mistresses comes, and every time that she visits their summer house, brings pastries for Elsa, his second wife, who then, of course, goes off crying while Einstein goes sailing with his mistress and has sex with her. So he does have this again with his family. He's almost verging on the edge of cruel a lot of the time, and I think that is just simply because he doesn't want any sort of constraint on what he can do, and what he wants to do, and what he's very good at doing is having affairs. He really is an incredibly flirtatious, incredibly charismatic man. You get that not just from the affairs, but the amount of friendships he has and the amount of very strong friendships that he has. He when I was reading all of the various accounts of people who've met him, Charlie Chaplin or the Queen of Belgium or whoever it was, they all in their writing just conveyed that they were totally in love with Einstein. He must have just been such a joy to know if you were not his wife and getting pastries from his mistresses.
So there's a very famous letter that Einstein writes to the wife of his best friend. His friend has died,
Yes.
and he says in the letter is the name of the friend. And again, forgive me because I'm American. I don't speak with your beautiful accent, but I think it's Michelle or Mikhail Bessos is the name of the friend. And in the letter, Mr. Einstein says that this figment of our imagination, more or less, this fiction, your husband has left us, but this is just a temporary illusion as a result of the way we perceive time. Now, I'm not quoting the letter exactly, but you're getting the gist of what I'm saying. And so, what was that all about?
Um, that's a lovely question because it touches on something which I think makes Einstein very human, which is this relationship he has with Michelle Besser, his best friend, almost all through his life, and they are very, very close. Besser has a huge impact on not his science as well as his personality, and I think there are two things going on with that letter. Three possibly, if I'm allowed a third. One is that Einstein is very close to death at that point as well. They die within a few months of each other. Besser going just first. And I think in the letter, Einstein starts by saying, yet again, he has anticipated me. So Einstein is aware that he is not well, and he is dwelling and thinking about death. And another is that he has just lost his best friend, who he has known for over 50 years. And there is a genuine outpouring of emotion in that letter, which is slightly unusual for Einstein. He is reasonably guarded with his sort of really deep inner emotions. You get a lot of his opinions and joys and laughter in reading about him, and some of his sort of worries. But it's very rare to get a glimpse into the really very deep sadnesses or loves. And in that letter, I think you get that. And then the third thing is that he is drawing on the science that he knows, which in physics, there are almost no equations which draw any distinction between which way time flows. And so he's saying that basically he is able to still be with his friend.
There's a stubbornly persistent illusion known as time, he says in this
Yes.
letter. And so do your best. You're not Richard Feynman, but do your best to explain that to somebody. What is this stubborn, persistent illusion that we know as time?
I am not Feynman, but I will give it a go. Einstein is slightly referring to his own work in relativity, which showed that there is no great clock in the universe. There is no one single time. We all carry our own times with us. We all have our own reference frames on the universe, and depending on how you're moving, time moves differently with you as you move. If you go very, very fast, close to the speed of light, your clock will slow down compared to someone who's not doing that. Time is relative. It depends on you, and it doesn't exist as an absolute thing. So there's that. And then there's also the fact, as I slightly alluded to, there are incredibly few equations in physics. Most of the maths of physics doesn't have time inbuilt into it at all. The equations, if you put them into a scenario where there is time involved, work exactly the same as if time were going one way as if it were going the other. It doesn't seem to have any effect on the mathematics. There is an exception, which Einstein is very conveniently ignoring. But most of the time, physics tells you that time is a stubbornly persistent illusion. It's something that we have made up.
Yeah, and I think he proves it through the math. And so this is perplexing to the average person, because we get up in the morning, there's a clock, we think the time is running in one direction, and obviously, because of the way we age biologically, we tie our aging process to the way the time works as well. And so we've got this whole thing going on. But I think Einstein's trying to tell us he's figured out mathematically that there's something else happening in the universe around us. Perhaps there's these five senses which we could observe the universe from are just not enough. Maybe there's other things that are happening beyond the three dimensions that we can observe. And this is what makes him, to me, one of the more fascinating figures. He's up there in my mind with Isaac Newton, obviously, because of the way he was able to take on this challenge. Okay, so we're at the point in the podcast, Sam, where I have 5 words. I put these out to people. We got into one of these words earlier in the podcast, but I'll use it again. I'll give you the word. You give me a response to the word. It could be a sentence, a word, something that makes you think. We'll start with the word Einsteinium. When I say Einsteinium, what do you say?
I would say element 99. That's its atomic number.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah,
It's fascinating,
entirely
right?
useless. Has
Yeah,
no
entirely
use.
useless, but a new substance in the universe as a result of these explosions.
Yeah.
Science.
The pursuit of a truth about the universe that can be experimentally verify. I think that would be something that Einstein would accept as a definition.
How about genius?
Um, a pursuit. I think that that's the argument of my book. It's not something that is sort of God given. It's not something that is extraterrestrially other that you or I have absolutely no access to. I think Einstein had a lot more know-how than we do about physics, but then worked very, very hard to get where he did. Yeah. So genius is a pursuit as well as a gift.
Okay, the word Albert.
Albert. Well, I quite like him. I think I think he's my friend in a very strange way. I know him better and in far more comprehensive way than I know anybody else. I've read all of his teenage love letters and I've read, all of his science, and I think
Yeah,
ultimately,
that's where I was really going with. Well, that's where I was really going because when you hear the word Albert, you think of the person. You think of
yes,
this loving, very complex, but also a sweetness, this charismatic, right? But then when I
charismatic.
say the word Einstein, when I say the word Einstein, it's a different word because it's now been institutionalized. Am I wrong?
Not at
So if I
all.
say the word Albert, you think of a person, but if I say the word Einstein, what about Einstein? The word Einstein, Sam. What do you think of?
I think of some of the other words you've already mentioned. Genius, mostly. I think that
Yeah,
Einstein has become the kind of figurehead or the poster boy of genius. And he
yeah.
played up
Well,
to that a little bit.
you did such a great job in this book because you separated the man from the myth, and it just got us all thinking here in my office. Albert is the man, but Einstein, in some ways, was the myth, right? This is when I say, "Hey, you're an Einstein," I'm telling somebody they're a genius, or I say, "Well, Einstein," you use this word, people think of it a certain way. And yet, underneath all of that, there was a flesh and blood person that you so beautifully describe in this book.
Thank you. Yes, that was my aim. So I'm very glad that it worked.
Well, listen, it's a terrific book. The title of the book is Einstein in Time and Space, A Life in 99 Particles. It's written by Samuel Graydon. And I really appreciate you joining us today on Open Book. Sam, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
In 1964, he won 61% of the popular vote, which remains to today the greatest share of the popular vote ever won by a president since 1820. Shortly afterwards, in 1965, he has gallbladder surgery, and Lady Bird Johnson kept a diary of every day of his presidency. So he was in the hospital for like a week, and she stayed with him most days, but she goes out one day. When she comes back, and she finds Lyndon Johnson with his good friend, Supreme Court Justice Abe Fortas, who he had put on the court. And he's telling Justice Fortas, I want to go back to my ranch in Texas. I don't even want to talk to Vice President Humphrey. I don't want him to be able to call me. I know they'll probably want to impeach me. They'll probably demand my resignation, but that's where I'm at. And in the middle of this conversation, Lady Bird walks in, and she's like, oh, this is like an avalanche. It's just fallen on my husband. She says the black beast of depression is back again. So she's telling us this isn't the first time that Lyndon Johnson has behaved this way. And he's behaved this way when he's on top of the world.
Joining us now is James Ricciardi. He's a mental health historian, and he's a former partner at McGuire Woods LLP. Not a book, but it's an article that drew my attention. It's about mental illness and highly successful persons, which I believe, by the way, Jim. So I would like to first go to your background. You graduated from Harvard. You were named one of the best lawyers in America, working on cases like Enron. But let's start with your background, and then we're going to go into some of the insights that you have about some leaders and how there's a close connection between genius, mental illness, and leadership. But let's go to your background first, sir, because I want to establish your gravitas.
Okay, well, I have a computer science degree from Ohio State. As you do, I have a Harvard law degree. And as you did, I didn't go immediately into practicing law. I went into business, and I wound up as a vice president and general counsel of an industrial conglomerate in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. The company wound up in a 3-year Chapter 11 case. And I hired outstanding New York bankruptcy counsel. And during those 3 years, I learned a lot about bankruptcy. And so I decided I finally found something in the law that I liked. So I called a very good friend of mine who I'd gone to Harvard with and said, Connor, I think I really like this bankruptcy stuff. And he said, well, we're just starting a bankruptcy department in our New York office. Why don't you come in for a day of interviews? I'll set it up for you. So to make a long story short, that's how I got my first job practicing law at the age of 37. And I only had taken a bar exam in New Jersey, but now I was practicing in New York. And New York and New Jersey don't reciprocate. So I had to take 17 years out of law school, the bar exam in New York State, which is
it's
one of
tough.
the hardest.
It's tough. Well, you passed it, and you're obviously an incredibly smart person. But you have your own mental health journey, and what I love about your story, if you don't mind me saying this, is that we sometimes have a stigma associated with mental health. We see it not for what it actually is. It's an illness like any other illness that we may have. If I have a bad heart, I take cholesterol medication. If there's something related to my mood, it could be biological more than anything else. And sometimes we attribute it to conscious behavioralism when it could in fact just be biological. So I want you to talk about first, if you don't mind, your personal story, your own personal mental health journey, and some of the revelations that you've discovered as a result of your own journey, and what caused you to want to write this article that you've put together. And then we're going to go over some examples.
You're right. I was first diagnosed with bipolar disorder more than 40 years ago. And I've had many episodes. They were almost always manic depressive episodes. And what I mean by that is I would have a mania first, and the mania would inevitably wind up in a depression. And for those of your listeners or viewers who don't know really what manias and depressions are, I'll take a minute or two to explain that. A mania is when your mind tends to focus on only one idea or only one very small subset of ideas. If you are, say, a mathematician, you might focus on the solution of a problem that has escaped solution for 200 years, and you might focus exclusively on that. And you will become irresponsible towards your friends, irresponsible towards your coworkers. You will become very irritable. You won't sleep, but you won't sleep not because you're depressed. You won't sleep because all of your energy is being put into solving that one problem. And you may or may not solve that problem, but inevitably, your mania is going to end up in a suicidal depression if you have bipolar disorder. And that was what always got me, because I didn't only work for McGuire Woods. I worked for two other leading law firms before that. And every time I made a move, it was because I had a manic depressive episode. And either the managements of the firms really didn't want to deal with it because, mental illness is not as important as physical illness. Or I myself couldn't deal with it, and I took myself out of the workforce for 6 months or a year and had to really struggle to get back. Now, the depressive side of it is almost always suicidal, but there are other aspects to depression. Also, you can't sleep, but it's not for the same reason as you can't sleep during a mania. You can't sleep in depression because you have constant feelings of worthlessness. Every future moment seems black. You don't see any way out of the situation that you're in. And it could be triggered by something like what triggered Winston Churchill, or it could be triggered by nothing, and mostly it's triggered by a mania that happens before.
But not to interrupt you, and I don't know as much about this as I should, frankly. Is it chemical? Is it environmental?
Neuroscientists almost exclusively believe today that it is biological, electrochemical, and neurological.
Right.
And all three of those things can be influenced by the genetic makeup of the person.
Right.
For example, a a person that has a predisposition to breast cancer, that predisposition is genetic. A person can have a genetic predisposition to bipolar disorder. A person can have a genetic predisposition to depression. You know, a person can have a genetic predisposition to schizophrenia.
Right.
Now, schizophrenia is in a different league, so we won't talk about that.
Right.
Because that makes life almost impossible. You know,
Right.
depression and bipolar disorder can be treated, but schizophrenia is almost impossible to deal with.
So,
I'm sorry.
No. I appreciate you bringing this up, and I appreciate the also respect the vulnerability associated with it, because it can be. Listen, 100 years ago, this was very stigmatizing. Today, it's less so as we understand more about the illness. The term, in some ways, is self-stigmatizing, but you have made enormous progress, and you've also. If you don't mind me saying this, sir, I appreciate you coming on, because there's lots of people that have this affliction, and it's important for us to dispel all of the stigmas associated with it. I don't know if you remember Mike Wallace, my friend Chris Wallace's dad.
Sure.
Was the famous reporter from 60 Minutes. He had this issue. He fought this issue, and but his openness probably led to more people getting help associated with this. So I appreciate you coming on, but you have let's say it's a breakthrough, but you have a historical observation, which I think is worth talking about. And this is, you've identified several leaders. I'm going to list some of them. Churchill, you've already mentioned. Lyndon Johnson, Thomas Eagleton. Well, we can talk a little bit about him. He was the vice presidential candidate that underwent electroshock therapy, a result of which he dropped out of the 1972 race. He was George McGovern's selection to be vice president. John Fetterman, which we know is in the Senate representing Pennsylvania, by his own admission, has talked about this situation that's plaguing him. The legendary Ted Turner, Mariah Carey, Francis Ford Coppola, Ernest Hemingway. I don't want to steal your thunder, sir. Tell us about these people, these specific individuals, also the observations that you've made about them, but also you have lots of empathy for them, because some of the elements that they have, you have. So tell us about these people.
Well, first, I'd like to talk for a minute about mental stigma. You know, mental illness was first identified by Plato and Hippocrates. So we've been dealing with this distinction between mental illness and physical illness for millennia. And you said we've made a lot of progress in reducing stigma of mental illness. I would like to challenge that. I think we've made a little bit of progress. And let me give you an example. Mental illness, of course, by its very semantic presentation, distinguishes itself from physical illness. And because of its history, going back to Plato and Hippocrates, it also is perceived as a lesser illness than physical illness. But you mentioned John Fetterman, and John Fetterman is a very interesting case, because while he was in the campaign for a senator from Pennsylvania, he had a stroke. You may remember he had a serious stroke. And after he won, a few weeks after he got to Washington, he was hospitalized for 42 days for major depression. 42 days. Now, when I was hospitalized once I was hospitalized after a suicide attempt, I was in the hospital for 12 days. He was in the hospital 42 days. So you know he had very, very serious major depression. But he never suffered any stigma. His colleagues in the Senate supported him. His family supported him. His doctors supported him. His constituents supported him. Why is that? Okay. Now, to me, why that is because all of his doctors associated his major depression with his stroke. So they made it a physical illness. That's why he had no stigma. They made it a physical illness. Just as if a person behaved in a manic fashion but had a brain tumor, and the brain tumor was removed, and then they were their old self again. there would be no stigma. But if they recovered from a mania that couldn't be associated with a physical illness, the stigma, remained.
It's a very good distinction. It's a very important point that you're making. But let's talk about a few of these political leaders, sir, that have no stroke. They've had no physical malady, but they have forms of depression. We
Okay.
believe that Lincoln had it. Let's talk about Lyndon Johnson as an example, or Winston Churchill, some of the people you write about.
Let's talk about Winston Churchill and Lyndon Johnson. And Anthony, you make me feel old when you call me sir. Call me Jim. Please.
I'll call you Jim. I'm sorry. I'll call you Jim.
Okay. Well,
all right. So, Jim, let's talk about these guys.
All right. Winston Churchill, in 1945, after he's widely acclaimed as the hero of World War II, his party loses an election for control of Parliament. And you know the way things work in Great Britain. You lose an election for control of Parliament and the Prime Minister has to resign because the new control party picks the Prime Minister. So after his years of being hailed as a hero, he's suddenly out of government. And almost immediately, he goes into a depression. And he's unique because we have a book written by his personal physician, Lord Moran, who details his depression. He details his depression. He details aspects of his bipolar disorder. And so another psychiatrist and historian, Anthony Storr, in reviewing Lord Moran's book and in reviewing records that became available only after Churchill's death, he says, I think that Churchill's achievements were not in spite of his bipolar disorder, but because of his bipolar disorder, which brings us back to what I was saying about tunneling and focusing on really important things and being able to solve really important problems, even though the rest of the world you treat like hell, And that's probably as good an explanation of Winston Churchill's life as anything. And it comes directly from the horse's mouth, his personal physician who treated him for years. And his book was written only after Winston Churchill's death. Now, Lyndon Johnson is a little bit different situation because he never had a contemporaneous diagnosis of either depression or bipolar disorder. But I need to set the scene for you a little bit to understand why I included him in the list of people. In 1964, he won 61% of the popular vote, which remains to today the greatest share of the popular vote ever won by a president since 1820. Shortly afterwards, in 1965, he has gallbladder surgery. And Lady Bird Johnson kept a diary of every day of his presidency. So from November 22nd, 1963 to January 20th, 1969, she's got a daily diary. Okay. So she was staying with him. Gallbladder surgery was more complicated then than it is today. So he was in the hospital for like a week. And she stayed with him most days. But she goes out one day, as she says, to do some errands. Okay. So when she comes back, it's dusk. And she finds Lyndon Johnson with his good friend, Supreme Court Justice Abe Fortas, who he had put on the court, but with whom he had had a 30-year relationship. And he's telling Justice Fortas, I want to go back to my ranch in Texas. I don't even want to talk to Vice President Humphrey. I don't want him to be able to call me. I know they'll probably want to impeach me. They'll probably demand my resignation, but that's where I'm at. And in the middle of this conversation, Lady Bird walks in. And she's like, oh, this is like an avalanche has just fallen on my husband. She says, the black beast of depression is back again. So she's telling us this isn't the first time that Lyndon Johnson has behaved this way. And he's behaved this way when he's on top of the world. So it's different from Winston Churchill. It's completely different from Winston Churchill, which is what convinced me that he had major depression, as defined by the National Institute of Mental Health. And there's actually more evidence. Bill Moyers, who was special assistant to the president and then press secretary to the president, and as we know, was the host of a show on PBS for about 30 years. He says that, the night that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, which many people have called the Bill of the Century, there were accolades coming in from all corners. All the TV stations were saying how historic it was. He wasn't down on the first floor with the staff and the senators and everybody in the celebration. So I went to look for him, and I found him in his room, in bed, depressed, and he didn't want to get out of bed to go downstairs to join the celebration. So there's another, like super achievement, and he's depressed. There are instances of manic behavior that are recounted by Jack Valenti and Joe Califano. And interestingly enough, the last volume of Robert Caro's biography of Lyndon Johnson was published in 2012. And all of the information I have gotten comes from books that were published after that. In fact, Lady Bird's diary was not even made public to researchers until 2017. And Hiding in Plain Sight was published in 2021. So all of the information I'm giving you was never available to anybody who wrote a biography of Lyndon Johnson before that. There's another very interesting thing about it. He made a speech, his first speech to a joint session of Congress on November 27, 1963, 5 days after President Kennedy's assassination. And he spoke about President Kennedy and President Kennedy's assassination. And he spent a lot of time talking about the Civil Rights Bill that would become the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But he also asked Congress for an all-out attack on mental illness. He's the first U.S. president that ever asked Congress to do anything about mental illness. Is it self-referential? Who knows, right?
Yeah, but I think it's an amazing story about his life. If you don't mind, go to some people that are contemporary, like Mariah Carey or Francis Coppola, the director of The Godfather, Apocalypse Now, etc.
Well,
tell us some of your insights there.
If you permit me, my paper, as you once described it, was a research paper. I've continued to do research, and I'd like to make a little detour.
Yeah, you got mad at me. All I was saying is it's a great paper, but I want it. It's got to go this way. It's got to go bigger, so it can be bolder. It's in the middle. Unfortunately, in our society, you got to go one way or the other. I want you to turn this into a book, Jim.
Well, it might be going to a book.
Yeah.
Instead of talking about Francis Ford Coppola or Mariah Carey, I'd like to talk about two other people, with your permission.
Right,
Kay Jameson and Kurt Cobain.
Perfect.
Okay. Kay Jameson is the Dalio Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University Medical School. She has been afflicted with bipolar disorder from early adulthood. So she is a remarkable person because she has the personal experience and the academic experience. And her second husband was a psychiatrist who worked for the National Institute of Mental Health, and they co-wrote a book about her bipolar disorder and how he helped her get through her worst episodes. So she's really a remarkable person. There are very few people that have both been the victim of a disease and also the person who studies and helps with the treatment of the same disease. And she reviewed Kurt Cobain's suicide. And we learned that Beverly Cobain, who was a registered nurse and the first cousin of Cobain, told her that he had been diagnosed as a young child with ADD and later with bipolar disorder. So she went in and reviewed the history of his medical records and the history of his family and found a family full of bipolar disorder, going back to grandparents, great-grandparents. And it's consistent with what we discussed before, the genetic aspect of bipolar disorder and depression. And it's just it gives one pause. And she also said something, she followed up on something you said, Anthony, which is that she believes, and she says this is anecdotal, she's never done any scientific studies on it, but she believes that bipolar disorder runs in high achieving and high creative families. It's just her experience from having done so much research on so many people who had bipolar disorder. So I'd like to finish with stigmatization on mental health. Number one, as you pointed out, mental illness distinguishes itself from physical illness. And let's just think about somebody who has a broken leg. Nobody ever says, oh, you don't need treatment, don't go to the hospital. But if you're depressed and you tell somebody you're depressed, maybe your husband or your son or your parents or your friends, they say, everybody gets depressed. Don't worry about it. Just think positive thoughts. You'll be fine in a couple of weeks. And a couple of weeks goes by and you're not fine. You're worse. And you're not sleeping and all you can see is black. And you tell everybody you're depressed and they say, oh, just give it another couple of weeks. Everything will be fine. So, if it's a broken leg, you go right away to the hospital. If you're depressed or you're manic, people try and talk you out of it. So that tells you it's a lesser disease in the minds of people. And that has tremendously negative effects. It discourages people from getting treatment. It oftentimes winds up getting people fired or they quit. Your relationships go south because you're not doing what everybody else wants you to do. And it's very difficult to recover those relationships. And mass media really doesn't do anything to help. I mean, virtually the only time you see mass media talk about mental illness is in connection with a mass shooting or a famous person's suicide. And those aren't two things that encourage people to seek mental health help, And they put a suicide hotline on at a time when they're not really encouraging people, because who wants to think of themselves as a mass murderer? Who wants to think of themselves as being ready to commit suicide? So if the mainstream media really wanted to do something, they would put public service announcements on every day. They don't have to be more than 15 seconds. They just show the same number. They say, if you're feeling bad mentally for whatever reason, call this number. Don't associate it with mass murders and with famous people's suicides. So, in a nutshell, I can see we're coming up to 10:30. If you have any more questions.
It's very poignant, and I wanted to. I don't like interrupting when someone is elucidating as brilliantly as you are. I have 5 words. If you listen to any of our podcasts, after reading your text, my producer and I come up with 5 words, and then we're going to ask you to respond to those words quickly. Okay, you ready?
Okay.
I say the words brain health. What do you think of, Jim?
I think really of brain disease. I think it's more important to think about brain disease than brain health, because brain health is a normal condition.
Okay. What about the words mental illness? I say the word mental illness. You think what?
Mental illness, I think climate change. I think we got to change it to brain disease, but it's not an easy task. It's going to take decades, just like it's going to take decades to solve the climate change problem.
Okay, it's good. It's a good point. And so that leads to my next word, which is stigma.
Stigma's got to be reduced, but people talk about reducing stigma, but don't understand how to reduce stigma.
Yeah,
that's what I was saying about the mass media.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm going to say the word success. What do you think of?
That there are many successful people who have dealt with serious mental illness or brain disease that we never know about, because it's not something people talk about.
Yeah. What about you, Jim? I say Jim Ricciardi. What do you think of?
I think that I've been very fortunate in my life. With all of the instances I've had of manic depressive episodes, I could have wound up a lot worse. I know I've been suicidal at least 4 times, and one time I wound up in the hospital. So I could have wound up a lot worse, and I'm happy to be able to do this research and to share it with people like you.
Well, first of all, it is a true delight to have you on. I think that what you're saying is very compelling. I hope you turn it into a book. Okay, the title of the article is "Mental Illness and Highly Successful Persons." It's written by James Ricciardi, and we're going to get this out there for you to publicize it. But I want you to turn this into a book, not just a long paper. So you can be mad at me for that, Jim, but I don't care. I think it's an important story to tell, and I think it'll help to bring down the stigma that both of us want to bring down about the disease.
I'm not angry. I'm not angry with you at all. I just knew that in the time that you wanted to have a podcast, I couldn't possibly turn it into a book.
That's okay. Well, you're on, and we appreciate you being here. Thank you so much for joining us today.